So I came this morning with a prop because I was out late last night having a really good time, and I think I need a prop this morning. So here's my prop. New storm hits markets. Okay, most of us probably are aware of that since yesterday, if not this morning. So you're a venture capitalist. How is this new storm affecting you?
Well, the new storm could either be the financial thing or that hurricane that we have down in the Caribbean right now. The latter, well, unfortunately, we're not traveling to the Caribbean. In terms of the financial crisis, it has a little bit of a delayed impact on venture. One of the important things to understand about venture capital is when you think about what it is as an alternative asset class, is it's something where the investors into venture capital put money in for a 12-year to longer time period, and they expect, because of the illiquidity that's associated with that, disproportionately high returns. So historically, it's been 30 to 35% per year, compounded over the 12, 15-year time frame. So because that's the time frame, it hasn't really impacted the actual finances that are going in. There's secondary impacts that are going on. One is you're seeing a lot of venture firms panic. Sequoia, which is a brand name venture capital firm, sent a note out to its CEOs last week saying that they request all of them to take a 20% pay cut and have every employee making over $100,000 a year cut back 10%, and they don't see us getting out of this for 8 years.
Yeah, that really bounced all over the blogosphere. I even picked it up, and it seemed to scare the bejesus out of a lot of folks. Right. Do you think they're overreacting, or
Very
what?
Much so. I think the industry is very prone to overreacting. This quarter alone, investments are down 66%. But when you look at what's really changed over the course of this year, take biotech, for example, people will say the IPO market closed. Well, it did, but that was only historically 10 to 15% of the exits that existed in biotech. So we've lost a very small amount. And the mergers and acquisitions have been blockbusters this year. Billion-dollar mergers announced even within the past couple of weeks, 160 done year to date.
Genentech.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very interesting. So let me go back to the VC and overall finance and economy kind of relationship. You're saying that people who invest in your firm, or basically in most venture capital firms, are investing through economic cycles, basically, right? Right. And they expect to move through economic cycles. They have a much longer time frame. And yet you have Sequoia sort of freaking out. Is it because what you're involved in is different from what they're involved in, which is more high-tech, more Silicon Valley stuff, and you're more into biotech, or am I missing something?
So they do high-tech and energy, we do biotech and energy. And that may have something to do with it. I think one of the other things that venture capitalists perceive is it depends where you are in your fundraising cycle. This is a really bad time to raise funds because no one wants to part with their money right now. We happen to have recently closed a fund, so we're pretty happy. We closed it a little bit before the whole mess really started. I don't know exactly where they are in their fund cycle right now, but that could have something pretty significant to do with it.
Oh, that's good. Now I'm kind of getting it. So, okay, so let's go from financial panic and its impact on VC to specifically what your fund does, and why it's unique in its way.
Sure. So Flagship Ventures is a traditional and non-traditional venture firm all wrapped up into one. We're traditional in that we have a fund, $800 million under management. We have about 50 portfolio companies, and we have our investors, and we like to see exits over a certain amount of time. We're non-traditional in that, in addition to just investing in companies, we actually found our own companies. And some VCs will say, we found a professor who has an idea, and we'll build a company with them, and that's doing that. We do some of that, but really the way we like to think about it is we'll make hypotheses as to where we can see the intersection of market pull and the potential for technology solution. And in those opportunity spaces, we'll either find a professor who has a unique innovation there and start a company with them, or more, what I prefer to do is not find anyone doing something there, create the innovation ourselves, and build a company from scratch.
So you do your own analysis, your
Exactly.
own. Do you do it?
There's two of us at the firm who do it. One of them is me, the other is Nubar Fain, our CEO.
What have you been doing lately?
Spending a lot of time in, well, both life sciences and energy. There's a lot of interesting trends that have been going on. In energy, for example, the power of things like synthetic biotechnology. In life sciences, we're getting a real capacity to start understanding what's going on at the cellular level with some of the new sequencing technologies that are coming out. And that's going to be reshaping the way we think diseases like cancer. And so spending a lot of time in both of those areas and trying to come up with some new innovations, which have led in the last couple of years to about 4 new companies that we've put together.
Wow. Can we take it down to a more granular level,
Sure.
each one of these things, because it's quite fascinating. In terms of biofuels, most of us understand biofuels just in terms of ethanol and corn and the problems associated with that. Where are you going in terms of biofuels? That I'm just assuming it's going way beyond that.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah.
So I think the trajectory we've seen within this country has been a focus on corn ethanol. That's been moving to cellulosic ethanol, which from an investment standpoint we got involved with. What we did 2 years ago was ask the question, if you believe biofuels have a place in our economy and a place in our fuel decisions going forward, why are we making ethanol when it has low energy density, there's no infrastructure, our cars can't use it, we can't transport it. And
Pushes the price of food up.
Exactly. So we said, is there a fuel you think would actually make sense to make? And very, very short answer is, well, yeah, petroleum. So one project we started 2 years ago, a company called LS9 that now has 60 employees out in South San Francisco, and just hired the guy who was number 2 in line for CEO at Tesoro as their CEO. They've re-engineered E. coli successfully to make petroleum from any sort of sugar-based feedstock. So it could be a cellulosic, it could be corn if you wanted it to be, it could be sugarcane.
Wait, slow down. E. coli
Yes.
is the basis.
Exactly.
And you're feeding E. coli with various sugars and do that again. This is really interesting.
So we take the same inputs that we talk about for any sort of ethanol that we talk about today, whether it's corn-based, whether it's cellulosic, whether it's what Brazil does, which is using sugarcane.
Yeah.
We take a common industrial host, which is E. coli, which has been used for countless plastics and other sorts of biologically based products. And we've completely re-engineered the internal workings of that cell so that sugar goes in, oil comes out. And it's chemically identical to the same stuff you put in your car. So it's not one of these where we brand it as green gasoline. It's gasoline. And if you want to call it green, call it green. We call it renewable petroleum.
Renewable petroleum.
And the only reason we call it that is because, it takes 100 million years to make a drop of petroleum by the Earth.
Yeah.
It takes us a couple minutes.
So the benefits of that, assuming that you can get the pricing right and the scaling right, is that we can create our own petroleum. The negatives of that is that it still keeps us within a carbon-based energy system.
So the big benefit of it is we can make our own petroleum domestically.
Yeah.
It's not the be-all and end-all solution, and we have a even better technology that we're bringing together right now. But the advantage of it compared to normal petroleum, and there's no question that if you burn a gallon of our gas and a gallon of, say, the gas from Saudi Aramco, it produces the same amount of CO2. There's no question about that. The problem is that the CO2 that was buried under the ground that we dug up got incorporated about 100 million years ago, and it's been underground since then. The CO2 that is getting burned and produced when you use the LS9 fuel went into the plant about a year ago, got incorporated then bioconverted into gasoline. So you're keeping a much smaller carbon cycle, and thus the net carbon impact is much less. It's not zero. There's work to be done to get there. It doesn't solve the environmental problem, but it makes it better.
So you're not releasing nearly as much carbon into the atmosphere.
Exactly.
Wow, that's very interesting. What is that other next stage thing that you're working on that you said is better?
So if you think about the Holy Grail, what, you bid on that? So if you think about the Holy Grail of what's going on, if you think about petroleum, really you're taking CO2 over a period of time, as I was saying, you're incorporating it, and what the world has done is CO2 gets taken up into algae, the algae dies, it gets processed in some mechanism that we still don't know, a lot of temperature, a lot of pressure, 100 million years, we go dig, we find oil. Wouldn't it be great if you could imagine just taking CO2, converting it right into oil, right here, right now, making it entirely carbon neutral, and more importantly, doing it with such an efficiency that you can actually now displace the way we dig up oil, because you can make it on that volume, which is something you just can't do with other approaches. So we started a company, actually now about a year ago, called Joule Biotechnologies, that's doing just that. And in order to do that, we've taken an entirely new class of organisms. It's not algae, it's not E. coli, it's something that's completely new and different from what other people are using, and completely re-engineered it to say, what are free inputs? Light, CO2, water, although not that much water.
And it's not that free.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And can you put that into a system whereby you can very efficiently convert that continuously into a fuel molecule of your choice or a plastic of your choice, and thus meet all of the petroleum demands with a, say, single type of organism.
What is this organism?
So it's something we've engineered from scratch. Not in the Craig Venter way of let's make a minimal organism, but just saying, what are the fundamental qualities? So if you think about what you want in these cells, is you want, one, you want them to be engineerable. Two, you want them to be able to process light. Three, you want them to be able to take up CO2. Four, you want them to be industrialized. And five, and pretty important, is you want them to be controllable. And so we took those first principles, laid out some ways you can imagine doing that with the same E. coli as your base, which doesn't really work all that well, or do it with other sorts of microorganisms that you find in really specialized locations in the world, and develop the tools to engineer them, develop the tools to industrialize them as we've done, and then systematically engineer them to have those right sorts of features.
That's fascinating. At the point of scaling either one of these systems, what are you going to do? Are you going to create your own company, or are you going to go to BP or a large energy company, or do you have any plans on that? How is that going to work?
So we founded these companies. They work as effectively independent companies. LS9 is completely independent from say, Flagship, except for the fact that we're investors. Joule is technically the same, although I'm running the company. And our goal is to build highly self-sustainable companies that operate in the best interest of what they need to do to be successful. Now, we could go and talk to BP and talk to Chevron and talk to Shell, and not to, say, offend anyone, but I'm not convinced that they have really the interest in creating a renewable energy economy on their mind.
Really?
Shocking, right? I mean, you look at BP Solar, and they haven't really produced any significant innovation. BP can't get rid of it, but they're not really making that much product. And they're not really sure where to go with that. The deals that Shell has been cutting have been really, rather than enabling companies, in my view from an investor, they've been disabling them.
Really?
And so when I look at what's the right way to market, you need distributors, you need partners, but I can't depend on ExxonMobil to make sure that my renewable technology that frankly is competing with them is going to make it there. It's like asking Google to depend on Microsoft.
Just checking. Just checking. So where are you going to go? I mean, do you think that you would raise the finances yourself and build the plants yourself, or?
That's what we've been doing.
That's what you've been doing?
Yep.
If you wanted to look for partners, where would you look for partners?
So we found a number of partners that, for example, one of our companies, Mascoma, which is in cellulosic ethanol, has partnered with both GM and Marathon Oil. There have been a number of people who have been looking to partner with LS9, and we're trying to figure out what's the right thing for that company. As it turns out, The states happen to be quite interested in doing things, so we're very actively engaging on both the state level and on the federal level. And other governments actually happen to be very interested as well. Now, I'm much more interested in doing things domestically, but of course we don't know what's going to happen in the future with the way our politics are going to work out. And so from a company standpoint, obviously you need to have the right sort of strategy to make sure you can be successful.
This is true, although we seem to be nationalizing everything except healthcare. So you might find a willing government agency or even DARPA, actually.
Right.
So have you had any calls from DARPA lately?
Not from DARPA, much more at the state level. New York, Michigan, and some have been very active in funding companies, supporting companies. Tennessee has as well. They recognize that if they can actually use what's otherwise a waste product for the state and convert it into a high revenue generating product like ethanol, like a renewable petroleum, like any other sort of fuel, and become a fuel producer like Texas, for all intents and purposes, it's a great opportunity from a job standpoint and a revenue standpoint.
Sure, that's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about the health science part of what you're doing.
Sure.
Dig into that a little bit for us, would you?
Sure. So one of the trends that's been happening over the last decade or so is our ability to have information about human life. And not just the whole LinkedIn type of thing, but in really understanding what's going on at the cellular level. In the late 90s, early 2000 period, we saw the entire human genome sequenced in about 2 years for an enormous amount of money. We now have machines that can start to sequence in a couple of weeks, can sequence the same genome in a couple of weeks. We invested in a company a couple of years ago called Helicos Biosciences that is really what's the frontier of sequencing. And this allows you for the first time to take a given individual cell and sequence the individual genome of that cell. And you can do that. Right now it takes you a couple of weeks. In about 2 years it'll take you a couple of days, and it's going to continue to get shorter and shorter and shorter. And they're moving very quickly on that curve. Now the power of that is that one of the things that's starting to understand is that we're starting to understand from a science standpoint is that, well, we're born with one cell that has one genome. The genome of every cell in our body is not going to be the same for the entirety of our life. We get mutations, we have recombinations. If you look at, and not to scare anyone, if you look at a...
After yesterday, no one's going to be scared.
Well, good.
We saw some really weird stuff yesterday.
Well, good, then hopefully this will be comforting. If you look at a heart cell of a 60-year-old male, the number of mutations in their number is in the hundreds to thousands.
Really?
And that's in your heart, which is a non-dividing cell.
What about your brain? Maybe you shouldn't answer that.
But the point of that is that we're starting to get a new understanding of biology. And more importantly, in diseases that are associated with mutations, i.e. cancer, it's going to probably prove important to understand how do the various cells start to differ from each other.
You know, the payoff from the sequencing of genome hasn't been great.
Right.
You know, there was this great expectation leading up to it and a great celebration when we did it, and then, you know, nothing really.
Yep.
Do you think this kind of technology might move us along in terms of getting something out of this?
Well, I think it's getting us closer. I think we were a little naive about the genome. I thought we had taken this notion that the genes are the answer. What we've also learned is it's not just the genes, it's the stuff we call junk. There's different pieces of RNA that are highly regulatory. We're still just discovering the fundamental elements of what controls biology right now. What we've been able to do from the understanding that's come after the Genome Project, not really from it, but from this real new understanding, is recognize that there's been an incomplete understanding in our minds of how we think about cancer. Some of it, in a way, when you think about it, is more obvious, some of it less obvious. But, for example, 90% of people who die from cancer die from the metastases, not from the primary tumor.
Wow, 90%?
90%. When we treat cancer, we treat the primary.
Yeah.
And we treat a little bit of how we go from a primary to other things. But we don't yet treat the metastases, partly because we've never understood metastases. And one of the things we've been able to do with genetic information and the detail that we can get is now start to understand what's going on in that process. And to that end, we've recently started a company called Theracrin that is very specifically going after that process that causes metastases, that maintains metastases. And the derivative of that is, as we all know, you can have cancer, you can have it removed, have it treated, and then sometimes 5, 7 years later, 20 years later in some cases, it comes back. And it turns out there's a very similar process there. So if we can treat that really changes the way we can think about diseases like cancer.
Wow, fascinating. I think, David, we ought to stop at this point. This has just been a wonderful discussion. I learned tons from you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
It's great.